What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Heretic plus Hexen, the remaster of those two games that was surprise released as part of QuakeCon this year in 2025. Now, a lot to get into here. This review is going to be a little different than my normal stuff for a few reasons, and this is typically where I tell people about the reviews after 100%. And while, if you are interested in that, you can find a link below in the description going over everything that I cover and whatnot. Heretic plus Hexen is a bit different because, for starters, it's a collection of two different games that are different moments in time, and obviously I want to cover both of them, but also, this particular genre of game for me, boomer shooters that is, I play mostly as palate cleansers between other big releases, and as a result, while I'm interested in checking these games out because of both their historical significance in terms of games history, and also just people asking me to take a look at specific ones, like Hexen was a big one people are always asking me to look at, but my main goal with these types of games basically is to just have fun and relax a little, and so I don't really aim to get quite as sweaty with these. With that in mind, still a few things to know. For starters, I did actually receive a review key for this. After it was announced at QuakeCon, Xbox reached out and asked if I was interested in playing it, as I have reviewed a few of these types of games before, and jumping into 30-year-old titles is of no issue to me. These remasters here also add a bunch of enhanced multiplayer functionality. I'm not going to get into that too much outside of just mentioning that it's possible. One of the only, ever so slightly annoying achievements for what are honestly very tame achievement lists for this game is the one that requires you to play in co-op, but if I'm not mistaken, you can actually complete that on your own, as the game supports local split-screen co-op, and you could literally just AFK two controllers and get it that way, as it just requires you to beat a level. So between an easy achievement list, my own nature with these games, again, was really just trying to have some fun here. And so, this review is going to be split into, I would say, three major parts. I'm first going to go over basically everything that was added, enhanced, changed, etc. across both of these titles, and then I'm going to jump into each individual one and talk about them, as there are obviously some big changes between each individual game. That said, some of the reasons you might be excited to take a look at Heretic and Hexen are that somewhat already alluded to the fact that they are considered pretty innovative at the time. So Heretic released in 1994 and Hexen released in 1995, both of which were made by Raven Software on a modified version of the Doom engine. And while that's pretty cool in and of itself, they were actually considered pretty innovative at the time, believe it or not, just including things like an inventory system, the ability to vertically aim, classes in Hexen, are all things that kind of made it stand out even at the time, and why I would say these games are so well remembered today. And I would have to imagine why people kept recommending I take a look at them. But what is actually included in this collection here? Well, basically it is the three original sort of campaigns for both of these games, that is to say, Heretic, Shadow of the Serpent Riders, Hexen Beyond Heretic, and Hexen Death Kings of the Dark Citadel. Those three games, or campaigns, were all the sort of base stuff that you will have already played if you'd played these previously. They did actually add two new episodes, which you could think of as an expansion for each game. This is Heretic Faith Renewed and Hexen Vestiges of Grandeur. I will say, having played through all five of these, you can definitely tell that Faith Renewed and Vestiges are newer in the sense that their layout and the way things are presented to you as a player are a little bit easier to follow and frankly a little less arcane as older titles from the 90s tend to be, and as a result, and especially the fact that they're new in general, I would imagine, and combined with some of the enhancements that these remasters made, are just generally a little easier to play. But outside of just those two new additions here, there's actually a whole host of enhancements, the vast majority of which are completely optional. And I mention that because if you just prefer the original version of these things, that's still available within these versions of the game. As an example, probably the easiest one to mention is that the soundtrack has been remixed and enhanced by Andrew Hulshult. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. But that's something you can toggle. You can just use the original soundtrack if you would prefer, although I will say personally I enjoyed the new one more. They've also made enhancements and changes to several levels across basically the entirety of the game. And if you don't like the changes to the way those things play, then you could just turn that off. But let's get into the other changes. So probably some of the biggest stuff straight away is that they have added 16-player deathmatch and co-op, and that is online cross-platform. Local split-screen deathmatch and co-op, you can go up to 8 players, so there's a bunch of new multiplayer stuff straight away. They've also integrated mods into the game at a pretty fundamental level. Basically, each individual game has a mod browser that you can look into, download, and obviously play through various mods to enhance the experience even farther. They've added support for things like modern resolutions. This is part of the enhanced levels in the sense that they, like updated textures and kind of moved things around a little to make them a little more accessible. And that is in addition to things like the updated UI, improved legibility, contrast and screen effects adjustments that weren't there originally. I believe there's a text-to-speech option even. There's also support for modern controllers. But a big question I'm sure people will have very generally is, what are those game balance and enhancement changes I mentioned? Well, the game is kind of vague about this. It's all basically under a single toggle for each individual time you start one of these campaigns. And the reason for that is that they're kind of far-reaching. In some various levels, this just means like they changed some small stuff here and there. And this is stuff I had to look up to be clear, because I wasn't obviously someone who played the originals and I had to look into it. But in other more drastic cases, what they've done is they've actually changed the layout and placement of enemies, as well as the exact locations and layouts of the individual maps. So in some places, these changes are really small, and in other places, they've actually drastically changed the individual levels, which is one of the reasons I wanted to mention that if you've played the originals and don't like these changes, you can just straight up turn that off. But from what I have been able to gather across the more significant changes in certain levels is that what they've mostly seemed to have done is made it a bit easier in places. Like levels that were considered like unduly difficult previously, they've mostly just addressed and kind of scaled that back a little bit in the enhanced versions, in addition to just making things easier to navigate. Though I will say, especially in campaigns like the Death Kings of the Dark Citadel, it is still extremely frustrating to get around. In addition, they've also, of course, fixed a whole host of bugs, translated the game into 12 new languages, added widescreen support, quick save, quick load support. So frankly, just tons and tons of changes and updates and fixes to the original 2 games. Now, another thing I wanted to mention in this section is the cheat menu. So these types of games from the 90s often had cheat codes just like hard-coded into them. And you can bring up a menu and either type in the cheat manually, or as another toggle, you can just have that be like a sort of cheat menu, allowing you to either toggle on or off a whole host of different cheats, which include things like just giving you all the weapons, clipping through walls, God mode, of course, killing all your enemies, that kind of thing. One of the big reasons I wanted to mention this in particular, though, is that some of these act sort of like console commands and can help you out of situations that might see you stuck. So, for instance, I think there are a variety of places throughout these individual campaigns where it's easy to kind of get soft locked, either because you don't know where to go, you don't know where the switches are, you can't find an item, or in some cases you might just get straight up stuck into a room or something. And in cases like that, you could, as an example, turn on clipping and just kind of move yourself to where you need to be and hopefully bypass the issue without having to do a whole bunch of like saving and loading. Just so you know. Now, all of that is also in addition to just the various variable difficulties for each individual campaign you start as well. Each one of them has a variety of different difficulty settings, adjusting, of course, enemy damage and health, things like that, if you're looking for that bit of extra challenge. Though I will warn you, the way this game saves is, of course, by default a little old school. In Heretic, if you die, you'll restart the level if you did not save manually. So if you find yourself ahead of a tricky section, you might want to drop like a quick save or something. And then in Hexen, there's a whole bunch of places where you can just fall to your death super easily. And you might want to drop a save ahead of those sections, because in Hexen, which uses a hub system rather than a level system, and it'll drop you back to the beginning of each map you are on when you die, just as an example. So the difficulties and the modifiers you pick are of note at the very least. From there, though, I want to dive into the actual individual games, Heretic and Hexen. We're going to kick it off with Heretic because it was the original and honestly much simpler of the two. But Heretic is divided up into Heretic, Shadow of the Serpent Riders, and the brand new Heretic, Faith Renewed. Now, surprisingly, there is a pretty big story to all of this that is going on, and it's easy to miss if you don't really care about it, but it is there. But in Heretic, Three entities known as Serpent Riders used their magic to possess and corrupt the 7 kings of your realm. The elves, of which your playable character is one, I think his name is supposed to be like Corvus or something like that, is one of the only surviving elves after your people sacrificed themselves basically to destroy the kings and their armies, and of course just generally fight back. As such, elves were branded as heretics, hence the name, and yours is basically a quest for vengeance for your people as you try to get to one of these Serpent Riders' Disparal. Faith Renewed picks up after all of that is over, and your character once again finds that people are worshipping Disparal, basically turned worshipping his remains and deifying him after his death, and I've actually seen his absence as some sort of apotheosis, and so your job is to put that down again, and Faith Renewed is kind of all about that. Now, of these two games, I would say Heretic is definitely the more traditional. Like, if you've ever played a level-based shooter, like, Doom, as an example, which these two games, of course, base their engine off of, Heretic will pretty much immediately be familiar, as it takes place across primarily 5 different episodes, or individual campaigns, that are each divided into about 8 to 10 levels, generally. Now, within each of those episodes, you'll keep your progress in between levels, whereas at the end of each episode, when you go into the new one, it kind of starts over fresh and is its own little bit of progression in terms of like finding and utilizing weapons and the like. Now, that's important because in Heretic, you play pretty much as one person who utilizes a whole host of different weapons, as opposed to Hexen, where you can play the different classes that I mentioned earlier. Now, structurally speaking, most of Heretic's individual levels are all very, very similar. Your goal basically is to run around, find keys, use those keys to, of course, either hit switches or open doors, which then typically will eventually lead you to the end game, which is like a switch or a pad that you walk onto to end that particular level. But that's the basic structure to basically each and every encounter you're going to have here. Where it gets interesting is, of course, how you utilize weapons and items and deal with the enemies in your way as you progress through those levels. What's more, there are, of course, secrets to be found on each individual level, and then each episode actually also has a secret level. This is also just straight up available via level select via the main menus for these, so it's not like they're especially well hidden if you want to go look at them, and you can just do it immediately. And at the end of Heretic, there's actually several secret levels that are all coded as episode 6, and a couple of those are actually really good for getting some of like the weapon achievements as an example. Now, of these two games, I will say that I really enjoyed the way Heretic handled both its weapons and items a bit more than I did in Hexen, where it was spread across the 3 different classes. So as mentioned, and not especially impressive these days, but these games have an inventory, meaning that you're going to be picking up what the games call artifacts, and you can use those in combat to basically do things like heal. There are potions of healing. There's also more offensive things you can get. One of my favorites was this like chicken egg you can get that just turns enemies into chickens, or at least the non-boss enemies anyway, at which point they're pretty ripe for the slaughter. But there's also more interesting stuff like the Ring of Invincibility, the Tome of Power, and the Wings of Wrath. Now, the Wings of Wrath don't generally seem to transition between levels with you, but what they do is allow you to fly, which is really important in Heretic, where you can't really jump. Hexen later on gets a little more free with the movement, and as a result though, being able to fly via this item in Heretic feels especially rewarding, and it's going to help you do things like find secrets and whatnot. Now, the Tome of Power is probably one of the most interesting items generally in Heretic, because what it does is buffs your character both in terms of damage, but also it fundamentally changes how your weapons work. It basically gives them an alternate fire mode while that buff is active. So one of my favorite weapons, the Hellfire Staff as an example, goes from being like a magical machine gun to instead hitting enemies but then spawning in AoE rain on top of them that continues to damage anything that walks into its path for a short while. And then the Dragon Claw, as an example, when it hits an enemy, then sort of AoEs out from the enemy it hits to deal splash damage to everything around it. The other item I really wanted to talk about, though, was actually that Ring of Invincibility. So this is obviously useful just because it makes you invincible for a short period of time, and that can make difficult encounters much easier, but it also has a slightly, I would say, secondary use for the most part, in the sense that Heretic's level design sees you walking over hazardous surfaces a lot. Like, they really enjoy forcing you to walk over things that are going to deal chip damage to you as you go. And unsurprisingly, a lot of items and things are hidden beyond those areas, and that's something the Ring of Invincibility can help you get past without it being too much of a headache if you're getting kind of tired of it after a while. Now, something that will also probably become apparent as you play through Heretic is that it is not a game with a lot of true boss fights, which is true of both this game and Hexen. There's a couple in there, mind you, but for the most part it's mainly just about, of course, handling different compositions and waves of enemies that come by you in just various situations, of course. Again, of these two games, Heretic is the simpler one, mostly because of when it released in 1994, whereas Hexen, which we're about to talk about, makes a lot of different changes to the formula, which results in some of my favorite and least favorite moments from this entire experience. So with that in mind, let's actually talk about Hexen specifically. So when it comes to the story here, we are basically talking about Hexen Beyond Heretic, Hexen Death Kings of the Dark Citadel, and Hexen Vestiges of Grandeur. Now, straight away, Vestiges of Grandeur was my favorite bit of this entire experience. I think they did a fantastic job with that. You can honestly probably tell that it is a little newer in comparison, as that is one of the new ones they added. And that is in pretty stark contrast to my least favorite, which was Death Kings of the Dark Citadel. I just really did not like how extremely tedious and kind of cheap a lot of the encounters in that one felt. For instance, that place just does not get tired of dropping you to your death randomly. It's also extremely hard to go basically anywhere, as like you have to jump around and solve increasingly nonsensical puzzles as you go. So while I mostly enjoyed Hexen more than Heretic, I did kind of want to call out that I don't think Death Kings was very fun for me personally, at least. Now, in terms of the story, basically while our character in Heretic battles the forces of Despairel, there are two other Serpent Riders. They are busy doing their evil dastardly deeds in other dimensions. We're going to play as one of three classes, or all of them across a hub potentially, to fight off one of the second Serpent Riders known as Korax. And that's basically the plot of Beyond Heretic, killing him the first time. Now, Death Kings of the Dark Citadel, the follow-up, is basically just fighting your way through hordes and hordes of undead that are left in the wake of their master's demise. Whereas in Vestiges of Grandeur, we see Korax basically being revived and rebirthed by some sort of shadow entity that seems to be pulling at the threads behind the scenes, and you'd like to get to the bottom of that. But first, you of course have to put down Korax after he has returned to blight the land once more. Now from there, let's talk a little bit about what makes Hexen unique. Well, basically straight away, there is of course the classes as well as the new hub system. So in Hexen, you can play as either a fighter, mage, or a cleric, each with their own different weapons as well as some unique abilities more generally. What's more, there's also the hubs that I just mentioned. So rather than be divided up into levels, this game is divided up into hubs with several different maps that are usually connected via teleporters, and then each of those maps individually kind of acts as the levels. But basically the structure here is to, from the hub area, go to the various portals, collect the different items you need from each individual area to typically unblock the path forward back at the central hub. As a result, this mostly sees you doing things like gathering various keys or hitting particular switches so you can get through various doors to gather up the items you need to unblock the way forward, as an example. In some cases, this is as simple as hitting a few levers, whereas other times it involves gathering up a whole host of different items. So just fundamentally, the game is laid out a little bit differently than the original. There's also some pretty big changes to weapons. You can also jump. They obviously changed the level design to accommodate a lot of this, but what Hexen, I would say, really lacks is a bit of weapon variety. You see, each individual class basically gets 3 weapons. Their basic starter weapon, and then their blue and green mana weapon, respectively. They all do actually have the ability to get a 4th sort of super weapon, but this requires it to be assembled in each hub. Now, while these weapons do have some commonalities in their intended purpose, they are nonetheless ultimately different, of course, and kind of respect each individual character's playstyle. Now, very generally, when you get weapons and they're all powered up and everything, then I think the fighter is probably the most fun to play, but the mage is probably the easiest straight away, and then the cleric is really fun if you can master their sort of parry mechanic, as the cleric gets the ability to block with a shield, and if you time that appropriately, you can actually parry the enemies that are attacking you, which is an incredibly effective way of dealing with enemies. So while it's got a little bit more of a skill ceiling than the other two, if you can get good at it, you can get really good at it. Mage just tends to be the safest in the sense that you have a lot of ranged options, and then fighter, you have to get up close and personal at first. And while they do have like a combo mechanic with their basic fist weapons, I never personally got a good handle on that. And so I would usually switch to a fighter once I've picked up some of their weapons, like the hammer that, if you have the appropriate mana ammo type, would actually throw other hammers at a distance, giving you some ranged options. The two weapons beyond their basic weapon either exclusively use or are simply enhanced by having either blue or green mana respectively. As an example, the fighter's hammer, you can use the hammer if you don't have any green mana, but if you have green mana, you do that extra hammer attack at the end. The assembled weapons also typically run off of this mana and are just generally stronger and have less uses in between, and once you are out of that mana, you have to switch to a different weapon, as an example. So all of that to say that each of these classes do actually play distinctly from one another, and you can switch between them at the central hub area. There will be like a book or a tome that you can switch between the characters at. This is important because the weapons you pick up are sort of set in stone, but once you pick them up, they're added to that particular class for that particular hub. So you can play as one class that is easier at the beginning until you get the weapons you want for another class, and then like switch over and kind of use them interchangeably in that way. But let's talk about some of the changes to the levels, which you may have spied in the footage already. So probably the two biggest things straight away, besides the class stuff, is the fact that in Hexen you can jump by default, and there are also a lot of breakable and interactable objects in the environment, as an example. For instance, there's a bell in the first hub that you can actually hit with a ranged attack to open the way forward from there. There's also like all sorts of crates and things in the environment you can break and find items in. You can break like stained glass in a lot of the churches and use those as alternate paths. In some cases you have to do that to move forward. So basically you can tell that in Hexen they kind of got the modified engine down to a science and were using it to do fun new things, which is where I think a lot of that innovation I mentioned at the beginning of this review really honed in on, and I think that is where you can kind of feel that they were really hitting the ground running. Now, one thing you do have to watch out for in Hexen is that, especially in the original two campaigns, Hexen loves to drop you to your death. Like, there are so many hazards and stuff where it's either like a jump puzzle and the punishment for failing or missing a jump is just that you fall to your death, or there's like various traps where they take the floor out from underneath you and you die instantly, and as such quick saving and quick loading is a pretty big deal in that one. Death Kings of the Dark Citadel seem to lean especially heavily into this, and it was my least favorite campaign as a result of that, as it feels honestly pretty cheap. But, of course, that's the risk you take with these older games, and once you kind of know what to expect, you can plan for it and move around it. But nonetheless, it is there, and it is something you should be aware of. With that in mind, Vestiges of Grandeur, as I mentioned, my favorite bit of this entire experience. I really enjoyed the way they laid out that hub. I think it makes a ton of sense, and while there is a fair bit of backtracking in between different hubs, like it's always pretty clear where to go, they've got it very well marked out on the map. I enjoy the enemy composition, and truth be told, it may well just be the result of having played through everything the game had to offer up to that point, and then on the final sort of leg of this journey, being able to sort of actually capitalize on everything I had learned up to that point might have just put me in a position to enjoy it more, I suppose. But I did really have a blast with it. And from there, I kind of want to talk Steam Deck support, and then positives and negatives and stuff, and then we'll wrap it up. So on the Steam Deck side of things, both of these games, and the collection as a whole, are in fact verified on the Steam Deck, and unsurprisingly, given both the look of the game and the type of game it is, it plays very well over there. If you're looking for something to play in like short bursts, I think Steam Deck is a pretty good way to do that. At worst, it looks like you might have to rebind some of your own keys via the Steam Deck layout as opposed to doing it in-game, but otherwise it seemed to be a pretty solid experience. Obviously no issues with things like frame rate or controller support, the usual stuff there. And so let's talk positives and negatives. So I honestly think most of the positives and negatives here are fairly self-explanatory. But for the sake of laying them out, on my end, the positives were all of the optional enhancements. I love that they added that stuff, but also made it completely optional, stuff you could turn off or on as you please, and you can enjoy that stuff on your own terms. Obviously, all of the updates to things like multiplayer and accessibility are great, and it looks like they put a significant amount of effort into making this a remaster that is actually worth playing, both in terms of if you had played it before and also if you wanted to play it for the first time. Now, I fully admit I'm not an expert on these two games. It was my first time playing them, but that seems to be the general consensus, and for the most part, it seems like everybody is very happy with it. Nonetheless, though, there are a few negatives, though again, these are mostly optional. For me, though, I would say the Death Kings campaign was just not a good time. I really didn't enjoy that one. The constant cheap falls to your death and having to redo a section got pretty old pretty quick. Strangely enough, I actually found the sort of lack of weapon variety in Hexen to be a bit of a bummer. I actually did prefer Heretic's overall weapon and alternate power system with the Tome of Power over Hexen's variations of the weapons. And while I overall enjoyed the gameplay of Hexen more, I did find myself just really preferring the weapons of the Heretic game. The only other thing I really wanted to mention here was that even with some of the enhancements and stuff, some of these levels and places are just opaque as to where you are supposed to go. It's easy to get lost in some of them. And the wild thing is, I was playing mostly with the enhancements where they brushed up on a lot of that stuff and made it easier to find your way, but even with some of those changes, some of these levels are especially obtuse when it comes to traversal. Now, it's not so complicated as to be something you can't possibly figure out or anything, and obviously these games have been out for a while as well, and in many cases you can't just look it up if nothing else. It is nonetheless of note, and it is probably going to be your primary point of frustration if you play through this for yourself for the first time, I would imagine. Which brings me to my conclusion, which is basically what you probably already know if you've watched up to this point, but it looks like Heretic plus Hexen is a fantastic way to experience two classics. Updating it for modern hardware, a bunch of optional choices, different ways to play the game, mods, quality of life, all sorts of stuff, and all of that for $15. Basically, if you're looking to play a blast from the past or just want to enjoy a simple boomer shooter to hack and slash your way to glory, Heretic plus Hexen is a lot of fun, and more than anything, I enjoyed seeing these two games that kind of pushed the envelope in terms of gaming history at the time. And while that was a very tumultuous period in gaming history and things were moving fast, I'm honestly just really glad I took the time to play this. I had a lot of fun with it, and I hope other people do too. But that is, of course, where we're going to leave this particular video off. Certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.